Hi, welcome to the 5% Club with your host, me, Bryan Mansell. And I'm delighted to be joined by one of the number one agents at EXP, Jack Flower. Jack, morning to you. How you well?
Yeah, doing very well, thanks. Thanks very much for having me on.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for coming on as well. So, look, you've recently connected with Gazeal, and fair to say, got off to a brilliant start with it. And you very kindly agreed to give up some of your time, your valuable time today, to sort of to talk to the estate agents that watch this and give them some advice about the good and the bad of working with Gazeal and how you've done it, because obviously you got off to a pretty quick start and it's been quite consistent. So do you want to sort of give a bit of a background really about where you are and what market you're in, and then sort of just run through how you found this and how you use it? Is that all right?
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely fine. So, I mean, yeah, to give you a bit of context on myself, I'm based here in Bath. We do sales and lettings around this area, predominantly in the city centre, but also in some of the towns and villages around here.
Beautiful.
And I had always wanted to look at a way of implementing reservation agreements or some sort of contract between buyer and seller from day one of a deal being agreed, because especially last year, I'm sure a lot of other agents experienced that it was a particularly bad year for fall throughs. It
Yeah.
was a more challenging market. Buyers were a little bit more less confident in terms of how willing they were to proceed with the purchase, and
Yeah.
so were pulling out a lot more. And had tried it once with solicitors drafting something between buyer and seller solicitor, but it was just a really long and slow process, and actually made, when it should make the purchase quicker, it made it longer.
Yeah.
So kind of avoided doing that after trying it once at the beginning of last year. And then when EXP approached us about Gazeal, it's something which I had heard and seen a few agents engage with, but hadn't had any experience of it myself. And you actually gave a call to all of us agents, taking us through what it is that you offer, and thought it's exactly the sort of product which I want to be offering to sellers and buyers.
Yeah.
And so the real implementation of it was to begin with sellers on pitches. So not really using Gazeal for existing deals that I had, because
Yeah.
we hadn't had that conversation, but for new business, approaching them, talking to them about what Gazeal is and what you guys offer. And my experience with sellers was pretty much universally positive. Everyone thought this is a great idea. It gives me more protection, and it also covers my costs should the buyer walk away.
Yeah.
That was the first step, and then really just moved on to then having that conversation with buyers on viewings when they were putting offers forwards. And actually, 9 times out of 10, it was an equally positive reception on that side. So it's been a lot easier to implement than I think a lot of people might imagine. You might
Yeah.
think there's a lot of friction and resistance to it, but I actually think buyers and sellers are craving this sort of product, and actually
Yeah.
they welcome the fact that we offer it.
Well, that's very much what I hoped. Obviously, with my background as an agent, I very much hoped when I brought this in. Can we just focus on again, for the benefit of the agents that are watching this, from when you talk about the sellers being universally popular, how do you go about starting the conversation? Because that seems to be quite a lot of people's um, negative point, and they just don't know literally what words to use to start the conversation going. Just take us through how you do that.
Yeah, it's a good question. And we've kind of implemented it into our actual pitch when we're out on the market appraisal. We've got a whole slide on Gazeal itself. And so usually we'll start that section of saying, in your experience of buying and selling, have you ever experienced either the buyer or seller walking away from the transaction and you missing out on it? And the vast majority of people, especially if they've bought and sold a few times, have had that rug pulled out from under them before.
Yeah.
And so you're kind of introducing that pain to them right away, where they'll go
Yeah.
back and say, yes, actually, before I bought this place, I was buying something else, and the seller decided to take another offer, and I got gazumped, or whatever it might be. So
Yeah.
most people have had that negative experience. I think starting with that is a good way to make them realize how rubbish the normal system is at the moment with how
Yeah.
the sales process works here in
Yeah.
England. And then just take them through some of the data which you guys have shared with us, anecdotal data on what our experience with it has been, and also the data you've shown on the percentage of fall throughs that Gazeal deals have versus the national average,
Yeah.
and that it's whatever, 30% better. So I think when you partner those things up together, people see it as a no-brainer, really.
Yeah.
And 250 quid, whatever the admin fee is for them, seems like a bargain when
Yeah.
that's what's on offer.
How do you get many people that you're discussing it with that maybe are first-time sellers that haven't experienced a challenge? How do you cover those sort of people?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think if they haven't experienced it themselves, it's then giving them some examples of bad experiences I've had as an agent where
Yeah,
deals have fallen through, where you can do everything in your power, but if a buyer has had a change of heart and wants to purchase something else, they can walk away as it currently stands with no consequences whatsoever.
yeah,
And I think people might not be fully aware of the cost that that has for you as a seller if you've already instructed solicitors, if you've already done things to the property to get it ready for selling. And so it's just educating them really. And I think when they're then aware of that, it's usually pretty positive. It's the challenge more I would say is on the buyer side, not
yeah,
so much the concept of it, but I think buyers are used to not having to pay anything up front when they purchase a property. So
yeah,
that's often the only limitation of explaining to them that this serves you a benefit despite there being a cost up front. But
yeah.
on the seller side, really, I haven't had a single seller who's had any resistance to it whatsoever.
Well, that's really good. Yeah, and that's very much similar to my experience of it. I mean, that's the whole origins of Gazeal were came around from my experience as an agent, and what I found to be the overwhelming desire by the public to have something that gave them some sort of
Yeah,
certainty and security in the deal. And of course, we built Gazeal for the people, the genuine people, and also by default, when you are or when a seller is offering it to somebody, to a buyer, it's a great way to, at the very early stage, to gauge for the seller the buyer's attitude towards the purchase. I guess most buyers that I've experienced, and I'd be interested to hear your view, are naturally concerned about things like surveys and these sorts of things. Yeah, we want to commit, but we don't want to, not because of the product, but because of the process.
yeah.
That we're worried that, well, what happens if this happens or that happens? And do you find that you get a little bit of that? And is it easy to sort of to give them some comfort that they are covered as well?
Yeah, that's the main concerns, and they're obviously completely understandable that buyers have, saying, well, what if there's a really bad survey and there's 50 grand of remedial works that need to be done with this house? Do I still have to pay my fee, my
Yeah,
penalty for walking away from the deal?
yeah,
And I think that's where, and this is a shout out to Megan as well at Gazeal, who's the person who I work with, who's very, very good
yeah,
at speaking with buyers on the phone, answering emails, any queries or questions that they may have, and also letting them know that there is flexibility with the reservation agreement. So if there are a unique set of circumstances, it's not set in stone. There are things which can be amended to suit each particular deal. And what's good as well is your draft agreement, which you can share with potential buyers. It's just a 2-page document. So
yeah,
it's not a really long legal document which they've got
yeah.
to spend hours and hours reading. They can literally just go to the section on the reservation agreement mentioning what the reasonable reasons for withdrawal are and look at all of those and go, yeah, actually that's probably my main concerns. What if I fail finance? What if I can't get what if I have a bad survey result? What if the chain collapses? And you're covered for all of those in the reasons for reasonable withdrawal. So I think when people have seen that document, again, 9 times out of 10, they think, okay, well, I am covered if
Yeah.
those things happen and I won't have to pay, and therefore I'm comfortable to sign and proceed.
Have you had any situations so far where buyers are very negative about it? We're not signing that. We're not coming. We're not going to commit and do all this sort of stuff. And if so, it's sort of two-part question, really. And then if so, what are sellers? What are their reactions to that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I think it's sort of, once you've opened Pandora's box with the sellers, there's no going back.
Yeah,
And, obviously it's a choice, of course, for a buyer if they're willing or not willing to proceed with purchasing and doing a Gazeal reservation agreement. And if there is resistance to it, which there have been a few buyers who said that I'm not comfortable with doing this, of course we'll still put the offer forward. We'll still see if the seller's happy with proceeding with it. But instantly, then the seller has doubt in their mind about that buyer, saying, "Well, why wouldn't they do it?" It seems like a really practical thing for both sides to do. It protects them in the same way as it protects me as a seller.
absolutely. Yeah,
So it does really, once people are aware of it, at least in my mind, sellers do really want a buyer to do it.
yeah,
And we've had one actually just a couple of days ago where we had a couple of offers. We did go to best and finals, but actually one of the distinguishing factors is one of the offers, they weren't comfortable doing the agreement, which is
yeah,
absolutely fine. You don't have to do it. But
yeah,
the other party was. And it wasn't the only deciding factor as to choosing that offer over the other, but for the seller, it definitely was a key factor.
Yeah.
Because it just meant that they have more security with buyer B rather than buyer A, who won't do the agreement.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting point. I'm glad you mentioned it, because when we designed it, it was largely based on my experiences as an agent, but also as a home seller and home buyer. And it was a very interesting one, because as a buyer, I was the worst buyer possible. I would make offers on people's properties. I would keep looking, and I would often, at the end of the, I mean, I'm admitting it all on camera, but would quite often, try to get the best deal for myself by lowering the price because of things on a survey or whatever it may be. But as a seller, when I had a very interesting experience when I sold my last house, I used Gazeal to do that, and I had two offers. One of them was 15 grand higher, which in any normal situation without the agreement, I would have gone for, but they were very unwilling to do anything. And of course, knowing the design of the agreement, as you say, is designed to protect them and me, the fact they didn't want to do it, even though I offered to pay for it, gave me a very clear indication that their intentions weren't really pure. So I went with the guy who had offered lower, accepted his offer, signed the agreement. And the moment I did that, 24 hours later, the original buyer came back and he said, "We'll do it now." And of course, I was already locked in. So the lower offer buyer had the protection against the other buyer because I didn't gazump him. I stayed with him. But the original buyer realized afterwards that actually, yeah, we should have done this really, because we really wanted the house. And I went with what I was considering the best buyer, not on price as a decision, but on their ability to offer me certainty, which was far more valuable to me than 15 grand at the time. And that deal thankfully went through without a hitch, which I was very grateful for. But in a normal situation, I would have played the two off, gone with the higher offer, kept my fingers crossed, which potentially could have cost me down the line. So, having used it myself in my own family situation, I can understand that the decision to accept an offer isn't anymore based purely on who's offering me the most or who's in the smallest chain. It's about the commitment that they're prepared to give.
Yeah, I agree massively. We've had experiences before using Gazeal on the agency side, handling the sale, where buyers have done that, where we've had best and final processes, and there's someone who's offered significantly higher just to secure the property, but then they've leveraged the survey and they've leveraged issues in the conveyancing process, which in my mind, at least, obviously I've got a bias, weren't real issues, to try and chip the price back down to where they actually wanted to buy it at. And so, if you've got this agreement, you avoid that happening, which it does happen a lot, especially in this market where it is more of a buyer's market.
Yeah. I mean, there is such a thing that exists in normal consumerism called buyer's remorse, right? And it's an interesting conversation to have about whether we believe that occurs in property transactions, but it does. People do, like you rightly say, but particularly when faced with competition, will try to outbid to secure it, just like they would do when they're auctioning anything or buying anything at like an auction environment, or the classic buy it now, isn't it, from eBay, which they coined it. But then later on, once you've got that, then you begin to feel this remorse. I'm overpaying. I'm paying too much for this. I feel like I haven't got a great deal. So you then look maybe through a different lens at things like survey results and conveyancing information to use any excuse to try to feel justified in getting that price back down to where you wanted it to be originally. And that's very much what the agreement is designed to stop, is to stop people worrying about trying to get the price down and causing conflict in a sale because it's such an emotional process, but at the same time provide that security for the sellers. So let's finish up with this question, really. You're on stage, you're talking to all of your colleagues, and they're saying, "What's the best advice, Jack? How do I get started with this?" What's your sort of advice for your fellow agents out there about getting going with this?
I think it's just fighting the fear. I think we have a preconception as agents that any sort of new thing or cost is a barrier to winning an instruction.
Yeah.
So, you don't want to charge, when we first started doing instructions and we were doing really good marketing, we wouldn't charge for that marketing. We thought, well, if we say we're going to charge for it and there's an extra cost for a seller, they won't instruct us. And then we started doing that and realized that actually sellers realize the value in good marketing and will pay for it. And I think it's dropping that same fear with something like Gazeal and a reservation agreement, where people think the worst, that some people might resist to it and therefore you won't win the instruction. And if you mention it, they'll go with another more conventional agent who doesn't offer these agreements. but it's just, hopefully me talking about it can give that agent the reassurance that that's not how it's been responded to. And actually, if you just overcome that fear and start talking about it to sellers, even just as an open-ended question, not saying it's something we have to do, are you open to doing this? I think you'll be pleasantly surprised about how positive the reception is from sellers and buyers.
That's good advice. You made the point earlier on. There's 2 points you've made that I want to pick up on quickly. The first one was that it's an option, as you've said a couple of times. That's really important to us, and it's good to hear it from you, is that you're not forcing someone down a path they don't want to follow. This is a choice. You have the way it is, or maybe a better way for you, depending on your circumstances. So you have the freedom to choose whether you want to offer it or not. The second point you made, which I think is one of the most important that you've said, is the value. And that's the key thing here, isn't it? Is that you're providing a value to somebody, a value proposition. And you may not, because you're not the person experiencing this particular move, understand how valuable that is. But once it's presented to the person who is moving, they themselves will feel the value, and therefore the cost to the value benefit is negligible. So that's a really good point, and we're gonna leave it there. Jack, thank you so much for coming on today and sharing your insights. It's a pleasure to work with you, and thank you again for your time this morning.
Great, thank you very much.